Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the fourth and final event of our webinar series on the impact of Korean popular culture on North America. My name is Seung-kyung Kim. I am Korea Foundation Professor in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures and Director of the Institute for Korean Studies. The Embassy of the Republic of Korea in the USA and Indiana University Bloomington are co-hosting the webinar series on this timely and important topic. I would like to thank Ambassador Lee Schwoch and First Secretary Kim Jae-jung at the Embassy. And at Indiana University, I would like to thank Dean Lee Feinstein and Jeanette Cummings, Director of Communications and Marketing at the Hamilton Lugar School of Global and International Studies, as well as Associate Director John Finch and Assistant Director Keith Seidel at IU's Institute for Korean Studies. Finally, the series would not have been possible without the fabulous lineup of speakers and the wonderful moderator. And I would like to extend appreciation to Drs. Sira Balseji, Candace Apps Robertson, Jenny Wang Medina, Michelle Cho, and Susan Huang. Special thanks go to Dr. Sira Balseji, who spearheaded this project and recruited the speakers for this series. In any other time, we would have held the webinar as an in-person conference in Washington, D.C. But because of the pandemic crisis, we were forced to resort to an online mode of delivery. Although an in-person conference would have been a great event, this webinar series has been able to demonstrate the tremendous reach of the online delivery system. These webinars have attracted more than 3,200 registered viewers, and even more watched them on YouTube. If you would like to watch the 3 previous webinars, you can find them by simply searching YouTube for the impact of Korean popular culture on North America. The 4 lectures in this series introduce Korean popular music, literature, films, and TV dramas, and explain how Americans are learning to appreciate these vibrant forms of Korean popular culture. Taken together, they provide an in-depth orientation for those interested in understanding this fascinating cultural phenomenon. As of now, we have over 600 people registered for tonight's lecture by Dr. Michelle Cho. Now I will turn to Dr. Susan Huang, who will moderate tonight's event.
Thank you, Professor Kim. Good evening, everyone. My name is Susan Huang, and I am an assistant professor of Korean literature and cultural studies in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures at Indiana University. I will be moderating tonight's session and the Q&A following the presentation. We anticipate an exciting hour and a half ahead of us with over 648 people registered for the event. At any point during the presentation and the Q&A that will follow, please use the Q&A tool to submit your questions for the speaker. Tonight's speaker is Dr. Michelle Cho. Dr. Cho is Assistant Professor of East Asian Popular Cultures and affiliated faculty in Cinema Studies at the University of Toronto. She has published extensively on Asian cinemas and Korean wave television, video, and pop music in such diverse venues as Cinema Journal, the International Journal of Communication, the Korean Popular Culture Reader, Hallyu 2.0, and Asian Video Cultures. Her first monograph is on the topic of 21st century South Korean genre cinemas. She is currently at work on a book project called Vicarious Media, which looks at mediated forms of embodied connection in Korean wave popular cultures. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Michelle Cho.
Thank you so much for that wonderful invitation or introduction. I'm really happy to be here and excited to be sharing this talk with everybody here. Before I begin, I just wanted to echo some thanks. Thank you so much to Professors Singyang Kim, Susan Huang, and especially Cedarbo Seiji for making this event possible. And also thanks to the Korean Embassy and the Hamilton Lugar School for sponsoring it. This talk, it is a product of, my interests in Korean television, my own fandom of Korean television. And it's, percolating a bit. It's been percolating a bit for a while, but also throughout the talk, I'm drawing on research that I've read and benefited from several other scholars. So I include references at the end of the talk for further reading, and I can also share this list of references with the talk organizers in case people who are here right now are interested in further reading. Okay, so I'm going to share my presentation with you and we'll begin. So I have 4 parts to this talk, and I'm going to start at kind of a basic level to get to answer the question of how changes in the televisual landscape have been very important for facilitating the crossover of Korean television into North America, and what the change in our TV consumption habits tell us about what it's like to be part of a globally connected and networked world today, and maybe some of the reasons why we may be drawn to television from outside of the places that we're from. So I'm starting very basic with this question of what is TV. So I'll start there, and then I'll talk a little bit about the history of the presence of Korean television in the United States and how it goes from being primarily content that is being consumed by diasporic Korean communities to spreading outwards to become more of a subculture within the United States, and now becoming part of a mainstreaming of global TV through the platforms that we now use to watch television. So then I'll talk a bit about what I mean by global television or global TV. And then I'll specifically focus on Netflix as a platform that's really changing the game. And I'll say a little bit about a particular drama, which many of you may have watched, called Crash Landing on You. Okay, so to start at a very basic level, what is television? I think we all kind of intuitively know what TV is because we have probably experienced a lot of TV throughout our lives. But I want to bring us back to a kind of early understanding of TV, which is really just about being able to share images and spectacle across a distance. So tele here is the prefix that signifies at or across a distance. And of course, vision here means seeing. Television follows on the technology of telephony, or being able to listen across a distance, right? So television was really this transmission medium or communication medium. And originally, television was conceived of as a way of connecting a group of people as a collective audience, and by doing so, to create a sense of community bonds or a sense of collectivity. This has been theorized in many ways as a kind of national community, so an imagined community of national subjects. But we'll see that also there are global dynamics of television, even from its early stages. So in a nutshell, television is defined as live synchronized viewing of mass audiences spanning across an entire nation, region, or continent. Now, the liveness that we associate with television as a broadcast medium has changed quite a bit, but I want to argue that there's still a sense of liveness that we get when we're watching a TV show that other people are watching simultaneously. So liveness in broadcast terms used to mean a kind of temporal liveness, that you were watching a broadcast of a live event. But that has shifted now to really only being the case when we're talking about sporting events or other sort of live spectacles that are being transmitted. But the majority of the television that we consume consists of pre-recorded content. But again, liveness comes back all the time in various ways, because as human beings with a desire for connection, I think we're attracted to this idea of liveness, simultaneity, of sharing experience with one another. So if we're talking about the Korean context, broadcasts, or this kind of transmission of a spectacle or a message from one source to many people, it begins, of course, with radio. So radio is a broadcast medium. The first radio station in Korea is started actually during the early part of the 20th century, during the period of Japanese colonial occupation in 1927. But the infrastructure of that broadcasting system, it goes through some changes of management, but becomes what we now know of as KBS, the Korean Broadcasting System. And TV is introduced to the peninsula or to South Korea after the Korean War. And it's a technology that uses the same terrestrial like transmission towers and electromagnetic signals to send, in this case, an image as well as sound. So those transmissions begin in the 1950s, but it doesn't really become a popular broadcast medium for the public until the late 1970s and into the 1980s. So there's a similar kind of story of a shift in broadcast technology from sound to image in the US as well. And so the kind of legacy television networks that we know of today, NBC, CBS, and ABC, I wanted to kind of show you that they also have this kind of national purview in their beginnings. So NBC refers to National Broadcasting Company, ABC is the American Broadcasting Company, and CBS refers to Columbia Broadcasting System, which is a subsidiary of the Columbia Phonograph Company, which later becomes Columbia Records. So you can kind of see this direct genealogical connection between sound broadcast and sound recording technologies, sound transmission technologies, and television. So these TV networks, they get their start in the 1940s, but again, in the US, because a lot of people don't yet own television receivers or televisions in order to receive the signals, TV doesn't become a kind of popularized medium until the mid-1950s. Cable TV is a new technology of transmitting signals through coaxial cables as opposed to through electromagnetic frequencies. And so cable TV's entry into the television landscape, it not only introduces a kind of new transmission technology, but it also diversifies TV distribution. So cable TV, it really does shake up the TV market in the US quite a bit, so that by the late 80s and 90s, a lot of people are watching a lot of cable television in addition to the legacy networks. And cable is always thought of as initiating this kind of transition from TV targeting a broad national audience to the emergence of niche audiences and markets that are subsegments of the larger population. So thinking about the TV audience in terms of smaller interest groups that might be interested in various different types of content, as opposed to the major networks that are really trying to capture a very broad public. So television spreads to Asia actually through the sharing of technology through the US military. So the first television network in Asia is actually started in Japan. It's NHK. And the television technology that is being used to set up TV networks in Asia, it's kind of first developed as, again, a communication system for military purposes, because the US military does have these bases in the Asia Pacific that it needs to kind of transfer information between. So television is introduced to Asia as a new technology during the Cold War. And it introduces, of course, this idea of being networked into or plugged into a kind of global information system, but it also brings to Asian viewers a kind of new cultural imaginary, because now we associate that kind of television technology in North America with domestic space, you know, having TV and watching it in your living room, as in the first image that I showed you. So what TV technology brings with it, in addition to this idea of being plugged into a kind of global network of information transmission, is this idea of a post-war consumer society, which is emblematized by nuclear families that are watching television together, and they're nationally conjoined by the new technology of network television. So TV certainly becomes that in South Korea as well, a way for individuals to plug themselves into a national community of viewers. But again, this doesn't happen in South Korea until a bit later, because of course the post-war, the first couple of decades of the post-war period were there were years of very intense kind of national development and a change in the wealth status of the country at large and lifestyles that were shifting increasingly to urban spaces. So really in the 1980s, television in South Korea becomes a very dominant public broadcast medium. And there are lots of developments that are happening at this time, including the kind of diversification of TV content. So there are news broadcasts, K-dramas, entertainment or variety show programs, and sports broadcasts. So kind of mix of information transmission, the news, and then entertainment, spectacle. There's the division of the TV industry into two networks, NBC and KBS. And probably most importantly for attracting a domestic audience is the introduction of color TV. The other thing that's happening in the 1980s, and I'm drawing on scholarship by Chung-Up Lee, who talks about this, is that TV gets integrated with other forms of popular culture, especially popular music. So for any K-pop fans in the audience, you may know that South Korea still has a number of weekly live music broadcasts like Inkigayo, or, you know, Show Champion, or any number of, like, I think there's a live TV broadcast for almost every night of the week. So this practice of integrating the distribution of popular music with television, it's something that is happening in earlier decades in South Korea, and it really has this earlier history, again, because if radio is a popular distribution method for getting new music out to listeners, since TV has this connection to radio, both as broadcast technologies, then it makes sense that TV would also be a site or a space where people are getting to hear for the first time new popular music. Now, shifting gears a little bit to talking about Korean TV in the United States. So if we were just talking about television in South Korea, the kind of counterpoint to that is Korean TV or Korean TV content in the US. So Korean television that's produced in Korea but distributed in the US has been accessible in the United States since the mid-1970s, but mostly targeting, or almost exclusively targeting, immigrant Korean audiences. So according to Sang-Jun Lee, who has done research on this topic and has really outlined the development or the progression of different audiences for Korean TV in the US, there was a kind of two-channel system in which you had Korean language TV stations that were operating in cities where there were sizable populations of Korean immigrants. And then sometimes Korean TV would also be broadcast on public access channels or cable TV, similarly in these markets. But alongside that, there were video rental stores in large metro areas. So people would go to rent, an entire K-drama series all at once. Oftentimes these video rental stores were located in the same place as Korean grocery stores. So they were really this place where diasporic Koreans would come together and they would be able to access the culture from their homeland and also connect with other members of the diasporic community. So yeah, I remember my parents and my grandparents, aunts and uncles, they always had VHS tapes lying around of recordings of popular dramas. Usually they were sageuk or historical period dramas, and they would watch them at home on their VHS player. I didn't often watch with them, partly because I wasn't really too into the genre of historical drama, but also because these videotapes, they were not subtitled, and neither was the Korean language TV stations that were broadcasting oftentimes. So this gives you a sense that this Korean TV is really directed at an audience that already knows Korean and already is familiar with the culture. So this starts to change with the with the rise of internet use, really. So in the early 2000s, Korean television, especially K-dramas, they start to attract viewers who are interested in it, who are not Korean themselves and don't necessarily know the language, but they have experience with other kinds of serialized narrative TV, either because they have grown up watching telenovelas or, Turkish dramas, or, there are Brazilian dramas. There are a lot of national TV industries that actually produce the kind of TV that we associate as serialized narrative. So shows that have a kind of beginning and end, and there's a continuous storyline cutting across multiple episodes. So it used to be the case that in American TV, the only TV that was formatted that way was soap operas. And so it was difficult to just tune in for one episode here and there, because oftentimes you wouldn't understand what was happening or what the kind of dramatic scenes were about. But it's interesting to think about why it's the case that television at large seems to have shifted to that narrative mode. And so I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. But so once Korean TV starts to attract audiences outside the Korean diaspora, they start to be able to be tracked a little bit by the purchases that they make in the DVD market. So yes, Asia is a source of Korean film and TV drama DVDs for a lot of people in the US, especially in the first decade of the 2000s. And oftentimes the people who were buying those DVDs, they were not Korean. Like 95% of those customers were not Korean. So that gave people a certain sense that Korean TV is starting to spread outside of just kind of Korean viewers. Also, this is a period of time in the mid 2000s where Korean TV is starting to be broadcast in many other places in the East Asian region. So when we think about Hallyu or the Korean wave, nowadays we associate it primarily with K-pop, but it really started with Korean television K-dramas as the core export that was traveling to places outside of Korea and really bringing this wave of Korean popular culture out into the world from Korean shores. So this idea of television, Hallyu or Hallyu television, it also starts to really build momentum once viewing practices of TV get untethered from the TV set and this idea that television is just, you know, these continuously broadcasting channels that you tune into, and then you are only able to watch whatever is being broadcast at that moment, to what's called over-the-top services, which refer to content delivery mechanisms that are not tethered to any particular network, but can happen on multiple devices. Video on demand is another kind of moment of development of the ways that we consume TV. It's not exactly the same thing as over the top, because sometimes you could watch VOD content through satellite TV subscriptions or cable subscriptions, but nonetheless, these shifts in how we got access to television content are happening kind of at the same time. And then we see the rise of streaming services. So that happens a bit later in the 2010s. So TV scholars refer to this transition of moving away from TV content that you get kind of, again, broadcast continuously, that you have to kind of let the broadcaster decide when you're going to watch something, to the kind of OTT or VOD services as a kind of shift to cutting the cord from the TV set. And I think nowadays, a lot of us watch television on multiple devices, on our laptops, on our iPads, on our or tablets, on our phones even. And so, yeah, cutting the cord from the TV set and moving TV out of the box. This is a shift that, you know, for those of us who experienced it, it was kind of a huge paradigm shift, but now it just seems so very normal. Before streaming sites really take over as the place where most of us are consuming Korean TV content in the US, there is this kind of intermediate space as well, or intermediate period, where there are these file sharing and kind of gray market streaming sites like mysoju.com, dramacrazy.net, where you're watching content that hasn't been licensed from the TV networks or TV producers. But given the kind of growing consumption of Korean dramas and the growing fandom of Korean dramas, these sites are really, really important, I think, for a lot of people who developed their K-drama addictions during the early part of the 2000s. So then there's a transition to streaming sites that are kind of above board. So they are actually contacting the Korean networks that are producing the Korean TV shows and licensing them, so paying, you know, a licensing fee, and then making that content available to their subscribers. So the first major K-drama streaming site in the US was Drama Fever. Sadly, it is no more. And the demise of Drama Fever is a kind of sad case of what's happening in the North American context in terms of media companies consolidating and then, trying to economize. And we can talk more about what happened to Drama Fever a little bit in the Q&A if you'd like. But Drama Fever was a huge player in the rise of streaming sites and the kind of platform delivery of Korean dramas in the US. Viki is also an important site. Crunchyroll is a site that starts off mostly focusing on anime and dramas that are J-dramas, but then also include K-drama content. And then Hulu and Netflix, which are subscription VOD sites, so SVOD sites, that we don't necessarily associate with Asian TV at all. They start to add Korean content in the early 2010s. Okay, so what happens during this period of time in American TV that makes Korean TV fit in so well with the content that people are starting to consume or be drawn to, and the ways that we consume TV? Well, again, there's definitely a shift, starting with kind of high profile cable shows to serially narrativized shows. So again, shows that have a continuous storyline that you have to follow over an entire season. And often these shows, they kind of become these bigger cultural phenomena where people are always talking about them. So shows like The Sopranos or The Wire, or Mad Men, or, these are some kind of, these are representative cases of quality TV, where, cultural critics are talking about TV during this early part of the 2010s as a pop cultural form that's almost taken over the role of novels. So this is where you see complex storylines with, an interest in social critique at times, or a kind of television that's fun to watch, but also makes you think, or that you have to focus on a little bit more than the way that you can watch a sitcom and it's almost like, junk food for your brain, or you can watch it while you're doing many other things, and you kind of forget about it as soon as it's over. So this idea of a storyline that will pull you in and make you more invested in watching a show, this is one of the characteristics of US television that's happening during this time. And there's also a shift to a conception of TV as a medium or a type of content that invites participation from its viewers, encourages cult fandoms. So shows are not necessarily as concerned about getting these broad audiences that you almost have to water things down for when you're talking about mainstream network TV. Shows are really more interested in finding fandoms of people that will be very, very invested, overly invested. And so they're not watching with this kind of distracted, in a distracted state, the way that you might associate with TV content when we were thinking about it as the boob tube, like the stupid box, or the thing that, kind of you watch in a distracted way, but doesn't really offer you much besides just mindless entertainment. So this interactivity gets, it kind of gets engraved into the practices of Korean drama consumption sort of during this same period of time, where there's a lot of interactivity, and that's coming through in a couple of ways. So one of the ways that viewer participation or interactivity is encouraged is through the act of subtitling. So Viki.com is a platform that people associate with fan subbing. There was a period when, when people were buying DVDs of Korean dramas and kind of complaining about how the official subtitles that were provided by the television networks were often not great. They didn't capture nuance, or they were kind of clunky. And so fan subs have always been understood to be superior to those official subtitles. So fan subbing, or fans who are subtitling and then usually into English first, and then from there into a whole bunch of other languages, that's been one way that participation has been encouraged. The other way that people were starting to develop a kind of fandom around Korean TV was through blogging and chat forums. So connecting with other viewers online in these spaces that were devoted to sharing information, squeeing together about various dramas, various actors, and just really kind of creating a connection among fans who might not have fellow K-drama viewers in their immediate circles. So in that way, it kind of resembles K-pop fandom as well. So I just have here a kind of list of a few spaces where this kind of fan community comes together. Drama Beans is an interesting case, which I'll talk about in a second, but it definitely is a big part of where I started to get plugged into the K-drama fan community, again, in the late 2000s. Nowadays, a lot of that conversation is happening on Reddit or Soompi or All K-pop or Soul Beats. So there are various internet spaces where people can participate by engaging other fans and kind of conversing, trading theories, etc. So the other way that I'm thinking about Korean TV as global TV is, again, its entry into platforms like Netflix. So I'm going to talk about Netflix a whole lot in just a second, but I just want to mark that as this other kind of sense in which we can think about Korean TV as global TV. I have actually the screenshot from dramabeans.com that I got from the Internet Archive, the Wayback Machine, and it is just to kind of blast from the past, because it shows the way that Drama Beans kind of got started as a space to, again, chat about dramas. Drama Beans is a site that was started by two diaspora Koreans who were able to, they're bilingual, so they're able to access Korean dramas immediately without having to wait for subtitles. And so that gave them the advantage of then being able to share their recaps of the dramas with an audience of English speakers. And so, yeah, that was an important space for people to learn about Korean dramas and start to connect over them. Okay, so Viki.com is a really interesting site for me. I find it really fascinating because it is a site that began as a language learning tool, started in 2007, and it basically got fans to subtitle the shows kind of in teams. And then it becomes a subscription site in 2013. So it takes a few years for it to kind of cohere as a platform. And so it is now owned by Rakuten. It continues to operate. But what I find so fascinating about Viki.com is that it holds on to this kind of earlier K-drama culture of subcultural fandom, because, again, fan subbing was a practice that fans of K-drama used as a way to interact with each other and to kind of provide a service for each other, to kind of give the gift of subtitles to fellow fans. And so having that sort of fandom model, that doesn't really exist on other platforms as much nowadays, that Korean television is mostly being consumed through streaming. But on Viki, it's still there. And you can still see kind of live commentary of other viewers. But it's also, again, like above board and licenses the TV shows that it hosts on its site from the media companies around the world that produce it. So it's kind of combining this very professionalized mode with a fan subcultural mode. Okay, so to talk about now Netflix, which is the world's largest subscription video on demand service. Netflix is a company that starts off as a video rental company. It's a DVD mail service. And so it got its subscriber base in the US as a replacement for brick and mortar video rental stores. So it kind of put Blockbuster Video out of business. So it decides to shift into streaming in the late 2000s, like around 2007. And it shuts down its DVD rental sector in, I think, 2012 or 2013. Around the time that it is kind of really putting all of its eggs in the streaming basket, it also makes this kind of decision to try to gain subscribers around the world. So to move outward into other media markets outside of the US. So it starts kind of close to home in Canada. Netflix Canada gets started in 2010. But the thing about Netflix is that, I mean, it's not easy actually to spread into other markets because each country has its own regulatory framework, its own laws concerning, you know, how publicly broadcast communications content is supposed to be kind of vetted and rated and that sort of thing. So through its expansion, it's been kind of working out these challenges because it is kind of difficult to get a foothold in other markets. But nevertheless, it is devoted and committed to this idea of becoming available in lots of different countries and becoming really a kind of global television, a global media distributor and producer. So the CEO of Netflix makes this kind of dramatic announcement at the beginning of 2016 that Netflix has embarked on this global expansion project and that it will soon be available in 190 countries. It actually starts service in South Korea in that year. And as of today, there are 183 million subscribers worldwide. What's interesting about this kind of, you know, globalization push and the unexpected outcomes of Netflix's commitment to globality is that, you know, it's really impacted both what American viewers can watch and what they've become accustomed to in the US, which is a wide variety of content from all over. But it's also extremely important in the way that it is affecting the South Korean TV industry. So I can talk about that more if we have time, maybe in the Q&A, but Netflix's practice of producing original content and also partnering with Korean TV networks has started to shift the Korean landscape of TV production pretty significantly. And so I think we're just going to start seeing more and more and more and more of these co-productions on Netflix. Okay, so nevertheless, if you look at Netflix regional growth, you can see that the largest number of subscribers are still in the US and Canada. Canada has about 7 million of these subscribers, so the US has 60 million. Incidentally, the number of subscribers of Netflix in the US is equivalent to the number of people who get cable. So Netflix and its content delivery model are kind of quickly overtaking the function and role of cable TV, or the way that TV content is distributed. So really, this kind of subscription video on demand is the way of the future. We can see this through the launching of NBC's Peacock just recently, that the legacy networks also want to be part of that transition. So this is definitely the way that TV is moving. Okay, so Netflix's content mix in the US is the largest of its content libraries. Netflix definitely looks different in different countries. I'm talking to you from Canada, and I can tell you that Netflix Canada does not have the selection of the US Netflix. So yeah, that's another one of the obstacles that Netflix faces in its globalization push, is that it can't offer the same variety of content in all of the different places that it tries to sell its subscriptions. Anyways, Korean content first is offered on Netflix in 2012, and I have seen over time the way that the algorithm has changed, where it used to be the case that you had to type in Korea or Korean in order to get the Netflix selection to offer you Korean content. Now, oftentimes that content is presented to you just kind of interwoven among other shows that are American or British. The initial range of non-US TV series that Netflix offered were only from 3 industries, the UK, Latin America, and Korea. So that gives you a sense of the role that Korean TV has played in kind of globalizing TV content in the US. And that is, again, because there was a large enough already existing audience in the US for Korean TV, even before Netflix started to market Korean TV to its American viewers. And so that really gave Netflix the confidence to try and go out and seek Korean series to showcase on its platform. Okay, so I'm at the last part of my presentation, and I'm going to talk about Crash Landing on You in particular. This is just a kind of screen recording of what my computer looks like when I log into Netflix and when I search for the show. So I watch a lot of Korean dramas, so you can see that, the show is presented alongside thumbnails of a bunch of other Korean shows. But in the second row here, there's also a bunch of non-Korean TV content. And so again, as I was saying earlier, the Korean drama content is presented on this platform in a way that doesn't necessarily ghettoize it as, specifically for Korean viewers or for viewers that are only interested in Asian television. It's, Netflix, even in its interface, is presenting a kind of idea that K-drama is mainstream TV, or it is, it's being mainstreamed in this way. Okay, so Crash Landing on You is a show that was co-produced by Netflix and the cable network TVN. It originally aired on Korean TV on TVN from December 2019 to February 2020. And it was a really, really popular series on the network. So the domestic audience in Korea found it very, very compelling. The viewership numbers reached 22% at its height. And just to contextualize that number a little bit, it's rather difficult actually for dramas nowadays to reach that kind of viewership number, just because of the variety of shows that are available, and also the way that people are consuming content. Lots of people don't even watch TV anymore. They just watch Twitch or YouTube. And so it's not like the olden days when, you know, a 국민 drama or national drama could get, you know, 45% viewership. So this number does give you a sense of what a phenomenon it was in South Korea. So it was released almost simultaneously on Netflix, and it was one of the most streamed shows during the early months of the pandemic. So I read some reports that it was the third most streamed TV show in March 2020 globally. So across the different spaces where Netflix operates. But again, as I mentioned earlier, the lion's share of those subscribers are actually in North America. So that gives you a sense of how much Netflix promoted this show and how popular it was. So again, the mainstreaming of K-dramas on these streaming platforms where most of us consume our television nowadays has given rise to this sort of journalism in the US. So I just have a couple of screenshots from a story by Kat Moon from May 2020, where she's kind of giving a set of recommendations about the best Korean dramas to watch on Netflix right now. You'll see, for those of you who are familiar with these shows, that you see the main characters, the protagonists of Crash Landing on You, Itaewon Class, and Kingdom, which are three kind of mega hit Netflix produced or co-produced Korean dramas. So in her article, she kind of starts off doing the thing that I was just mentioning that Netflix itself does, which is kind of putting Korean dramas amidst other TV or entertainment content that we do not associate with diasporic audiences, with Asia, or with ethnic kind of culture necessarily. So she writes, after months of staying at home to help stop the spread of the coronavirus, many people have binged their way through the expected fare, Tiger King reality competition shows, the entire Disney catalog, movies about social distancing, et cetera, et cetera. And then she suggests that, you know, why don't you instead watch some Korean dramas if you're just looking for new content to binge on Netflix. So then her next paragraph kind of gives us a very capsule summary of what features of Korean dramas people who like to watch them can identify as common elements, and as a kind of repertoire of tropes that you do start to be able to identify if you watch a number of Korean dramas. So with cliffhangers in every episode and endless variations of star-crossed lovers, separations, and deaths, K-dramas almost always guarantee an emotional roller coaster. So yes, these are shows that will definitely tug at your heartstrings, make you laugh, keep you on the edge of your seat, sometimes all in the same episode, definitely all in the same drama. So this is the appeal, I think, the emotional investment that viewers have, because K-dramas are a form of melodrama that makes them so popular, and also gives them a kind of genre form, or a genre container that we can identify these elements and tropes of K-dramas. And, you know, we're often drawn to certain genres because we want to see variety, but we also want to see sameness. And so K-dramas definitely satisfy that desire for novelty, but with kind of reliability at the same time. Okay, so just to mention a few plot elements of Crash Landing on You, it's a romance drama that centers on a couple. The woman is a South Korean businesswoman. The man is an elite military officer in North Korea. They meet because of a paragliding incident in which the female protagonist accidentally finds herself in the DMZ. And then the male protagonist, instead of turning her over to the North Korean authorities, he actually tries to help her to return to South Korea safely. And in the process, they fall in love. So what's really unique about this drama, which, based on the description, you might be thinking like, that's the plot line of Shiri, or, some other Korean blockbuster film, if you're familiar with Korean film. But actually, it is really unique because it sets the first 9 episodes of its 16 total episodes in North Korea. And it's a North Korea that is depicted in a way that has never happened in South Korean media, because North Korea is presented as a space that is more than just this kind of brutal, hostile place where everybody is starving and where people are reduced to just like abject misery, which is a trope of representing North Korea that you can find in other South Korean media. The reason why, so the plot line is obviously fantastical, and this is indicated by the way that the paragliding accident happens. It's almost like the tornado in The Wizard of Oz, and it all seems very enchanted. But there are plot elements that are bringing in actual events that were reported in the news. So in 2008, a South Korean actress drifted across the maritime boundary between North and South in a boat and then had to be rescued. And then in 2005, a 20-year-old North Korean soldier defected across the DMZ, and he was reported to have been motivated by his desire to live a South Korean lifestyle based on the fact that he was illegally watching Korean TV and popular culture. We don't know if that's like a propaganda message, but nevertheless, there is this sense that this other North Koreans who have resettled in South Korea, so who have defected from North Korea, have mentioned as well the influence of South Korean popular culture on their decision to leave because of the positive image of South Korean culture and society that they get from that content. Okay, so within the production development, there was extensive consultation with North Korean defectors. There was a North Korean who actually became a co-writer of the drama, who had studied filmmaking in Pyongyang and then defected to South Korea. And so there's a sense here that the story is almost co-written with North Korean contributions, with North Koreans who are now resettled in South Korea. And so this is, one of the reasons why there is a sense that the portrayal of life in North Korea, of this kind of village life, has a certain realistic quality, even if the storyline is kind of absurd, because again of the participation of North Koreans in the production of the show. So it's not clear whether or not those elements are evident to viewers outside of South Korea. They may be attracted to the show because it is very much a Hallyu product, a Korean wave product. And it is clear in its casting because the actors Hyunbin and Son Ye-jin are A-list Korean wave actors who are famous all across the world, all across the region, especially the main markets for Korean wave cultural productions in East and Southeast Asia. You can see that there's a high level of engagement with the show through exchanges between viewers in English on Twitter and YouTube. So that gives you a sense of this kind of global Korean wave fandom, and how people who are interested in the Korean wave definitely found this show to be a part of that. Even though, again, the show focuses on a local kind of geopolitical tension or conflict. Yep, so that's the image of the two leads in the Netflix thumbnail. So I'm really interested in the way that a show like Crash Landing on You, it engages viewers in the way that we know Korean dramas do more generally, through a kind of strong emotional affinity with characters, especially when you're watching romance and melodrama. But I'm also really interested in the way that viewers start to think about their own cultures vis-a-vis what they're seeing on the screen, and maybe also start to pay attention to the kind of the specificity of the geopolitical situation. I was talking to a friend who does not have any other prior experience with K-dramas, who watched this show during the pandemic. And she said that she thought that the scene where the two lovers are separated at the border on penalty of death, so there are, North Korean and South Korean authorities that are kind of threatening them at that moment, that she found that to be the saddest scene that she had ever seen in television. So, it got her interested in thinking more about the geopolitical situation, and it made her feel like she could sympathize with the characters and the experiences that the characters were having. So in closing, I want to say that maybe there are a couple of takeaways that we can think about when we are thinking about the question of what the impact of Korean TV has been in the US. So of course, there's this increasing crossover appeal of Korean television and popular culture in North America that tells us that pop culture content from outside of North America is increasingly normalized, and it's, possibly an indication of the ways that our media landscape is changing to be less kind of focused on American media, and just to offer more diversity in the kinds of images, the people represented, and the experiences that we see in television. Another conclusion is that, on the basis of this research about the way that audiences respond to Korean drama, we can kind of get a sense that that watching TV content from elsewhere than where you're from, it makes you sort of think about your own culture in relation to what you're seeing. It forges cross-cultural relations, but importantly, it resists cultural essentialism. So that's an argument that's been made in scholarship that looks at the way that K-drama viewers and fans, they're actually really careful about making blanket assumptions about Korea or Koreanness on the basis of what they watch in Korean dramas. And part of that is because Korean dramas are so formulaic in terms of their genre that we can't assume that we're seeing a kind of, direct reflection of reality, given the genre conventions that actually dictate the way that stories are constructed, and the kind of characters that we see. So we're getting some information about Korean culture and society, but not in an essentialist way. And so then the last takeaway, and especially in relation to Crash Landing on You, is this idea that global TV can reshape public understandings of current events and geopolitical conflicts through sympathetic connection. So it can get people to start thinking about the ways that they may be implicated in a kind of global community or a world that extends, again, outside of their own locality and cultural position. So that's my presentation. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Cho, for this very illuminating talk. We will now entertain some of the questions that have been raised from our audience tonight. So the first question is, Dr. Cho, for you, what is the difference between the narratives and script structures of K-dramas from other series or soap operas, non-K-dramas?
Yeah. Well, so Korean dramas have really, really perfected the cliffhanger ending. And I think that that is such a staple of K-dramas. And I don't think that I've seen anything like it in other, so TV from the UK or the US. And so there is a kind of rhythm of conflict and resolution that's happening as kind of smaller narratives within the larger narrative arc. And so I think that structure is incredibly important to creating the kind of episodic feel of these K-dramas, even though there's also this kind of continuous storyline. So I think that's what makes them so bingeable.
So this is a question specific about Crash Landing on You, which I enjoyed thoroughly myself. What is your opinion, Dr. Cho, on the sort of nostalgic depiction of North Korean rural idyllic daily lives and the friendliness of North Korean people, as opposed to a normatively more propagandistic picturing of North Korea as a non-lively top-down authoritarian state, and also in comparison to the highly capitalized South Korean society? What do you think is the message that we can decode from this writing of North Korean life? And does this reveal a popular form of entertainment, or does it reveal through this popular form of entertainment a sort of a general pro-unification sentiment of South Korean audiences between the South and the North?
Mm-hmm. That's such a great question, and it's like multi-part. So
I can repeat it.
No, it's okay. I think I got it. So first, I think that the nostalgic depiction of North Koreans, it kind of follows a pattern that actually has been developing, I think, for a little while. There are precedents to this of kind of depicting North Korea as a version of South Korea's past. And so I think that the nostalgic picture that you see of North Koreans in Crash Landing on You is part of that kind of tradition of creating sympathy with North Korean people specifically, and of course not the government, by thinking about a shared past, and especially a rural past. So I think in the show, the characters that are associated with positive sentiments are generally those that are that live in a village, right? So away from the big kind of glittering city of Pyongyang. And so, yeah, there's a kind of mashup here between North Korean rural life and South Korean rural life, and how that's all imagined in a nostalgic light. Whether or not this show indicates a kind of broader desire for reunification, I don't know, because, you know, if you survey Koreans, especially younger Koreans, I think that a lot of them are not in favor of reunification because of their concerns about the economic impacts that could happen, or the ways that, you know, the job market is already so competitive, and then introducing, you know, another 30 million people that could, you know, make things even more untenable. So I think that there are mixed, I Yeah, I think also if we think about the show as having this very unrealistic dimension, then, we might think that the desire for reunification is also couched in that kind of fantasy space. But I don't want to make any kind of determinations here, but I don't think there's necessarily a correlation between the political will that's necessary for reunification and the kind of nostalgic desire that you see in the show.
So the next question asks, thinking about your last points about affective consumption and the popularity of Crash Landing on You, given the, until now, what used to be a very highly gendered nature of K-drama consumption overseas, to what extent do you think that the increasing use of Netflix as a distribution platform and the growing diversification of K-drama storylines will cause an evening out of sort of the female and male viewership globally?
I mean, I think that the questioner, that's an amazing observation more than a question, because I agree completely that what we're seeing in Netflix dramas, and this was happening to a certain extent in South Korea already, but through the way that cable networks were kind of giving the big three networks in Korea some competition in terms of the types of drama content they were producing. We were already seeing a kind of diversification of Korean drama genres or forms. So you have, shows like Signal or shows like Misang that are, either more in the police procedural or thriller or workplace drama that don't emphasize romance. And so that definitely is broadening, I think, or making more even the gender split. But then what's happening, I think, on Netflix is very much expansion outwards from just the kind of typical romance drama. Although I will say that the majority of the shows that Netflix has co-produced have been in the genre of romance. And so they know that that's reliable and it's a staple, but then they are willing to branch out on a series like Kingdom is the big example here. It's a show that actually got shopped around in South Korea for many years, and no network would actually agree to finance its production because it was not seen as a viable show that Korean audiences wouldn't accept it. Mm-hmm. And so Netflix, the reason why Netflix kind of has co-produced a lot of other shows with Korean Netflix or Korean networks, but in the case of Kingdom, that's a kind of standalone Netflix only production, is because, no Korean networks would be involved with it at all. And so, and that show clearly does not have a majority female audience.
Next question is, what do you think about these American remakes of K-dramas, such as The Good Doctor? Do you worry about any watering down of sort of Korean culture in these remakes, or do you think that there are universal themes that translate internationally?
I don't really worry about this idea of like watering down Korean culture, Koreanness, because I think that, these remakes, they involve the kind of localization, or they transpose the narrative elements into a different culture anyways. And so it's not like they are, they're really adaptations, I would say. And we see the Korean TV industry also pursuing opportunities to sell remake rights, to sell formats. So, like Masked Singer, that's a North American remake of a Korean variety show program, right? Other variety shows have been very, very successfully remade in the Chinese market, right? So I don't think that these stories are necessarily the space to transmit Korean culture necessarily, because a lot of the narratives, again, like the Cinderella story, it's a transnational story. The Korean elements come in the Korean production, obviously, because you get to see the Korean setting and the language and all of that. The remake will just be kind of borrowing plot elements, but I don't think that it's about kind of, there's no like Korean essence that's contained in that story. That would be, I guess, my answer.
Next one is, so we've heard much about Korean television dramas or K-dramas. What do you think about the growing interest of some fans on different contents of Korean TV, such as variety shows that are not usually streamed on platforms such as Netflix and are more common on sites like Viki? And what do you think is the difference that makes these kind of shows to be popular across worldwide audiences?
So I have done a lot of reading in kind of research on variety show television in Asia. And there are definitely specific regional elements that you don't see in other industry contexts. Specifically the use of on-screen text. So that use of like funny text, not necessarily to tell you what people are saying, but to kind of comment from the outside. That is an element of Japanese TV. You see it a lot in Korean TV, and also, you know, Chinese TV does that as well. And so that kind of stuff doesn't translate that well. But I will say that, you know, Netflix has been interested in all types of content from, you know, the beginning of the launch of its service in Korea. And that is in order to gain Korean subscribers. So it actually produced a couple of comedy shows, like stand-up comedy specials of Korean comedians, again, for the Korean version of Netflix. So I think that, yeah, again, we'll see kind of a broader diversification of the types of shows that are produced and presented on that platform in particular. And I agree that it's been surprising to see kind of international audiences get very attached to Korean variety show television, because it used to be thought that you can't translate that kind of humor.
Yeah.
But actually Korean humor, a lot of it is wordplay, but a lot of it is also slapstick. And that's very translatable, actually.
Exactly. Yeah. So now that we've landed on this issue of translation, there was a question about fan subbing. And let me find that actually. So the question is, you mentioned during your talk that some people feel like fan subbing is superior to official subtitling. But when a corporation leverages a fan subbing model, do they compensate these subbers in some way? And if they don't, would that be considered exploitation of the fan subbers? I've heard of some K-drama fans choosing not to watch Viki because they feel that there is exploitation involved.
Yes, I actually think that it's kind of amazing that Viki has been able to continue to use fan subbing as its mechanism for subtitling its shows. The way that I explain it, though, because this question of exploiting viewers, it comes up a lot in fan studies or discussions of fandom. You know, are fans exploited by media producers? If you ask them, they would say no, because they're not going to say, oh yeah, I signed up to be exploited. they would say that what they get in return is a sense of community. They have a sense of joy in investing their time in this way, that they want to be a part of the subbing group, and they get a little bit of like kind of a micro celebrity. If they are the subbers for a very popular show, then they often get a lot of like thank yous. And so this question of, you know, whether or not this is an exploitative model, I think it is personally, but again, there's a reason why people are doing it, and fans are not dumb. A lot of very negative stereotypes about fans have to do with this idea that they're not intelligent and making rational choices about their actions. And that is just completely false. They're very, very thoughtful, and they know why they're doing what they're doing.
So the next question is, several popular K-dramas such as When the Camellia Blooms or Itaewon Class are considered Netflix originals. What does this connection to an American company say about the dramas that are shown on the platform? And are there any differences between these dramas and other K-dramas?
So the Netflix originals label is actually attached to co-productions and original, like Netflix only funded shows. So I don't know about Itaewon Class, but When the Camellia Blooms, I think that was a co-production with a network. I don't know that the content of these shows is necessarily different in the subject matter that's taken up, or the way that the characters are written or anything like that. Because again, I do think that cable networks have been kind of pushing the envelope in terms of producing storylines and spotlighting groups that maybe you don't associate with the Korean mainstream. So like single moms, or like, you know, multicultural or mixed race Koreans and foreigners in Itaewon. But what is very distinct about Netflix originals or Netflix co-productions is the production model, the economics. So Netflix has been very, their ability to invest in a show kind of goes beyond what is normal in the industry. And so they're actually putting up a lot of money usually for production. And that helps with like labor conditions, that makes production companies much less dependent on the networks, because the networks usually they offer a slot for broadcast, but they may not pay people. They may not actually decide what the value, sorry, my cat, of the show is until they see the ratings. So this is why a lot of TV production companies go bankrupt, because the economic model is actually very, very unstable and is quite exploitative.
So next question is, would you say that this boom of K-drama accessibility on the international level has contributed to the recent film festival and film awards show successes for Korean films such as Parasite?
I think that the arena of film is quite different. And I think that people have always imagined that audiences for Korean film and for Korean TV are quite different. And South Korea has been a kind of player on the international kind of film festival circuit for a while, and has also done so through a kind of deliberate investment in kind of Korean film production, promotion, also establishing a number of important film festivals in Korea. but I do think that just the mainstreaming of Korean content more broadly has, again, made Korean TV, film, and pop music more relatable, more, still novel in a lot of ways, but not something that is totally illegible to American audiences. And so, yeah, I think that there is probably a kind of cumulative effect of having such easy access to Korean pop culture content in the US that, yeah, just makes people more accepting of it, more interested in it.
Thank you. One last question up for the night. So what do you think makes K-drama so addictive?
This is a great question. I think that so I would attribute it to two things. I think that the emotional pull, it really kind of pulls you into the story and the story world. And so you kind of want to be immersed in that world. I don't know if other people have this experience, but I certainly have, of watching a show and getting very involved in it. But then if the show's episodes aren't all available already to binge, then I stop watching it and then I kind of forget about it. I've kind of snapped out of it and left that world. So I think that world building in Korean dramas is very strong, and there's a sense that you really get sucked into not just a kind of storyline or a courtship or something, but then you also get sucked into the larger world that's built around them of secondary characters, setting, if there are other like organizations, like a workplace or a neighborhood or something like that, you really kind of get pulled in to that emotional world. And so I think that's one reason why they're so addictive. Like, you may not want to leave that world. And then the other factor, I think, is about repetition. I think that we are comforted by repetition sometimes. So if there are elements of a K-drama that are familiar or that you've seen before, that you can kind of understand because you have seen other dramas and they really are these tropes that repeat, yeah, that can give you a sense of, like, this is a novel and new world, but it is also predictable enough that I think I'm guaranteed a certain kind of emotional payoff. And so I will put in the time. And so I think that that's also one reason why, I know people now who really prefer Korean dramas over any other kind of TV. And so they're like repeat, like they do, even if they watch Korean dramas on Netflix, they go through all of the new K-drama recommendations, and that really becomes their preferred genre of TV.
So thank you so much, Dr. Cho, for such a fascinating talk. And I would like to thank all those in audience today for making this last event of our webinar series such a memorable one through your thought-provoking questions. The Impact of Korean Popular Culture on North America webinar series are made available on YouTube should you want to revisit them and share with your friends at a later point as well. Thank you again, everyone, for your participation in our series. And on that note, I wish everyone a good night. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Cho.
Thank you.